Let's review the fight between Brienne of Tarth and Arya Stark. Hey there, I'm Matt Easton of Scholagladiatoria. I'm a fencing instructor, antique sword dealer and general obsessive with anything to do with swordsmanship. So I've been asked by many of my viewers to review the fight, or training fight should we say, not really sure whether it kind of verges there on almost a real fight, between Brienne and Arya. So let's have a little look at it. So the first thing to consider are the two very different styles of combat and swords being used. A lot of people have actually asked me about Arya's needle and what is it? Well, first of all, it is not a rapier. Dispel that from your mind right now. Rapier is a much longer and larger type of weapon. Really what Arya has is an épée blade or small sword blade on essentially a type of very simplistic small sword hilt. What I'm holding here is an actual antique small sword from the Napoleonic Wars period, or end of the 18th century, and as you'll notice, this has a somewhat more comprehensive guard than Arya's weapon. Now I suspect the reason why they gave Arya a fairly pared down guard there, which really only has a cross guard and a D-ring and no knucklebow to speak of. So there's no knucklebow, there's no finger rings there, and there's only a side ring, no shell guard. And I think the reason they probably did that was to make her weapon look more correct or more acceptable in a medieval type of environment. If they'd given it this type of traditional small sword hilt, it would have looked too developed and too advanced for the period. Now that being said, Arya's weapon is quite unusual for the context of Game of Thrones. We don't see anybody else really, except maybe debatably for one Braavosi fighting in the arena against Ser Jorah. Except for that, maybe he uses something rapier-ish. We don't really see a weapon like Arya's needle anywhere around, so it is quite an unusual weapon within the Game of Thrones context. Within real history, the small sword was a very, very popular dueling weapon. Now, what are the peculiar qualities of the small sword and indeed of Arya's needle there? Well, number one, and most importantly, it cannot cut. Remember that, because we do see cutting actions made with this sword throughout the seasons of Game of Thrones, and these cutting actions by themselves would not do anything. This, I remind you, is a real antique small sword that was probably carried by an officer in the Napoleonic Wars, and as you can see, I ain't gonna cut anything with it, okay? Certainly not through clothes and not even bare skin. Now indeed you might say, oh, it's not sharpened, but the important part to note that this sword, just like Arya's sword, is triangular in section. That is, it does not have a proper front edge and back edge like cut and thrust swords do. This is not a cut and thrust sword. This is an utterly specialised thrusting sword. The reason it's triangular is to make it really stiff and rigid in comparison to its very light weight. So for a minimal amount of metal, you've got the maximum amount of stiffness, a bit like a lance point. And therefore it's fantastic at thrusting, at penetration, but completely useless for cutting. That's not to say you couldn't hit someone with it. You could actually absolutely whip someone with it, but you're not going to cut anything with it. In complete contrast, Brienne of Tarth is using a longsword or bastard sword, that is a hand and a half sword. A sword that can be used in one hand, or because of the length of the hilt, in two hands. A very, very versatile weapon that was particularly popular from the 14th to the 16th centuries in medieval Europe. And it's an interesting, it made me happy to note that they've actually specifically shown that her and Pod are actually using rounded tip, blunt training weapons. Something which annoys many people who know about swords when we watch training scenes in like Lord of the Rings and things like this, is they use their actual sharp weapons for training fencing. Now this is, whilst it can have some bonus points in terms of training methodology, it is very destructive to the swords, and obviously if you're trying to keep your weapon sharp, you're going to be ruining your edges when you're using it for training and practice. And of course, it's super dangerous. If you're cutting and thrusting at your buddy who you're supposed to be training with, you don't really want a sharp point on your weapon or sharp edges, because you're going to increase the chances of injury. And we know that historically, the majority of training weapons that were used in the medieval and Renaissance period and right the way through to modern times were blunt and in many cases made more flexible than their actual sharp counterparts. So she's using a blunt weapon. Arya is using a sharp weapon, the actual weapon that she presumably keeps sharp and uses in combat. And given the disparity in the weights of these weapons, is it possible that maybe the longsword might damage or even break a small sword? Well, this is something that comes up often, and in actual fact, small swords, even more so rapiers, but even small swords are quite able. They are nevertheless still a bar of steel. Don't think of them, they're not made of plastic or anything like that. Just because they're thin doesn't mean that they're weak. They're still a flexible, strong, tempered bar of carbon steel. So it's actually relatively unlikely that a small sword would get broken in contact with a long sword, but nevertheless they're very two contrasting weapons. A heavier two-handed weapon, a light one-handed weapon, a weapon that can only thrust versus a weapon that can cut and thrust, or at least the sharp version of it would be able to. And this of course is Brienne's using a training weapon, and Arya, not very sportsman-like or sportsperson-like, is using a sharp weapon. But anyway, Brienne probably thinks, well, I've got my armour on, what the hell, let's go for it. So let's have a look at the fight. Okay, so there we had an absolutely classic example of, well, let's break it down. So the first things that Arya did is a fairly simple deflection or rabat parry. It could possibly have been sloping parry, I couldn't really see very clearly. Absolutely fine. Then she did some avoiding thing, oh yes, very ninja or very kung fu. Could a person do this against real full speed sword blows? Well, just grab the sword for a minute. There's a simple issue here, and that is that we can move our bodies at certain speeds, and obviously some people have got slightly quicker movements than others and slightly better reflexes. But the tip of a sword moves really quickly due to leverage, due to the fact that we're holding the back end of a lever, and when we move the back end a little bit, the front end moves a lot. And that means that cuts in particular travel really, really quickly. Can you dodge a cut? Possibly, yes. Can you dodge a thrust? I would say more reliably, yes. But a lot of people think thrusts are quicker than cuts. This is a slight misnomer. A thrust only moves as quickly as your hand, whereas a cut actually, certainly in distance covered, actually travels more quickly than a thrust, because of course there's leverage added to it. So the tip is now traveling at a faster speed in a cut than the tip's traveling in a thrust. Could you dodge over either of those? Possibly, yes. You know, I'm not gonna sort of gnash my teeth over this idea. She is supposed to be like an uber ninja, no one, and yes, so absolutely she can dodge weapons. Now, the last bit is the only bit really that I take umbrage with. She is using a small sword. Why, therefore, is she hitting with it or cutting with it when it's not going to cut anything? And what does that symbolise? Yes, indeed, against some unskilled or unwise opponents, if you brandish a small sword at them and hit them with a small sword, then indeed they might react to it. However, Brienne is an experienced fighter and can clearly see what type of sword it is she's facing. So even if Arya hits Brienne with cuts with this small sword, they count for nothing. They certainly won't do anything to armour, and even out of armour they won't do anything to her. Anyway, let's watch some more of the fight. So yet again we see Arya with her small sword cut, 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 and she hits Brienne in the leg, which doesn't do anything, even though I don't think Brienne has any armour down there, because it's a small sword. Why is Brienne cutting with a small sword? Seriously. I understand that this is what Syrio Forel taught her to do, but when she was being trained by Syrio, she was using a wooden waster longsword. She was using a cut and thrust sword. Needle is not that. And when you have a different type of sword, you often have to use it really quite differently. There are some swords which can be used in similar ways. Sabres, side swords, back swords, they can be used in similar ways to each other. Long swords and katanas can be used in similar-ish ways to each other. Small swords are a very particular weapon that have to be used in a particular way because you can only thrust with them. And the whole style of using a small sword is dictated by that fact. Now, Arya here is very clearly cutting, and you have to say, you also have to criticise Brienne. Why is Brienne parrying these cuts? Because she could just ignore them and just hit Arya, because she can take a hit from a small sword just as I'm taking now, but I certainly am not going to do that with the long sword because it'll chop into my arm. And that's the same thing with Brienne and Arya. The final thing that they finished that exchange with rather nicely, I thought, is Brienne just fairly casually parried the blow and kicked Arya onto her back, which is nice. And again, is this historical? Yes, absolutely. We see it in historical systems. You can see it in Fiore de Liberi's Fior di Battaglia from 1410, for example, as well as Hans Talhoffer's treatises. Anyway, let's carry on and watch a bit more of the fight. Now, believe it or not, that may have looked like a very simple exchange, but there were some very nice things in it. Brienne was putting in attacks with a longsword, which, relatively speaking to the small sword, is a powerful and heavy weapon. It's not heavy in real terms, it's only about 3 pounds in weight, so any of you could handle it. And in fact, for people who are a little bit weaker than average, or average, shall we say, longswords are quite a good weapon to start with because you've got 2 hands on the weapon, and in that sense they're a little less tiring. But one of the issues with trying to defend against such a powerful weapon, in terms of if you just put blocks in or parries, is the guard, the parry as it were, collapsing when someone's striking with a more powerful weapon, a weapon they've got 2 hands on, for instance. Whereas with a small sword, you've only got 1 hand on it and the blade is light. That means the exchange of momentum, or the inertia you feel on the blade, is going to be really difficult to stop those attacks with the longsword. And instead, we actually see Arya sweeping aside the attacks in what I would call beats or rebats, or deflections, if you want to think of it like that. And that's actually really, really good. And I, full kudos to the choreographer for thinking about how would this super light weapon deal with a more powerful, heavier weapon. And indeed, that's one of the ways it would be dealt with. Anyway, let's carry on watching the fight. And there we go. So there were a couple of things to comment in there. Again, we see Arya doing cuts like you might do with a sabre or backsword or some other type of cutting sword with a small sword. Like, don't do that. And also, Brienne, don't bother parrying it because you don't need to. And then ultimately she got disarmed. I'm not sure whether that was a convincing disarm or not, but you can disarm someone, that is, knock the sword out of their hands, simply by beating their blade strongly in the correct angle, in the correct part of the blade. And it's more likely to work if you're using a heavier weapon against their lighter weapon. So indeed, I don't have any real issues with that disarm. And of course, we knew the second that Bran gave Arya that dagger that she was going to use it for something. And I'm sure the fact that it's Valyrian steel is not going to be lost on the script writers either. I'm sure absolutely in the future we'll see her using its Valyrian properties against, I don't know, White Walkers or something anyway. But the fact that she got disarmed and immediately came into grapple, pulled her dagger out, essentially they ended up in a neutral position. Now, just to sum up, I think that this was actually, by Game of Thrones standards, a really well choreographed fight. I've never been shy about stating the fact that I think the fights, the one-on-one fights, for the most part in Game of Thrones are quite poor. They're not as good as, for example, in the Lord of the Rings films. The choreography varies between locations. It's very clear that they had better choreography in some locations than in others. And I've also been never shy about stating my opinion that I think that pretty much every fight that Jaime has ever been in, with a sword anyway, looks rubbish. It looks really, really bad. So the choreography in Game of Thrones, as far as I'm concerned, varies from really bad to okay, quite good. And this was at the top end of that scale for me. I think this was quite good. I enjoyed watching it. My only real big issue with it was that Arya has got a small sword. Why does she keep cutting with it? And you know, at some point this would be a script writing issue as well, because if she did hit an opponent with a blow from a small sword and that opponent magically died or was incapacitated, we as the viewers who know anything about small swords would have to go, why? Why are they wounded? Why are they dead? Because a small sword blade, a triangular épée type blade, as used in modern sport fencing, but just sharp at the end, will not cut. Even if you sharpened those edges, it will not cut. And it certainly will not cut someone wearing armour like Brienne is, or indeed anybody wearing anything, and certainly not through clothes or anything like that. So my only issue really with this fight, I enjoyed it. There were some bits where Arya does the kind of typical kung fu thing of holding the weapon up behind her in a flashy pose and stuff like this. I thought were a little bit cheesy, but I don't mind that. I like a good kung fu film anyway. So my only criticism really was stop cutting with your small sword, Arya, because it's not going to do anything. But by and large, congratulations to the choreographer and of course both the actresses for doing a pretty good scene that, frankly, even though I'm a massive critic of fighting in movies and TV, nevertheless, I did enjoy it. So thanks a lot. I hope this was fun to watch, and I'll see you for my next movie fight review. Cheers, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and feel free to follow us on Facebook.